Autopsy doctors of Reddit, what was the biggest revelation you had to a person's passing after you carried out the procedure? I'm not a medical examiner yet, but I'm getting there. I thought I'd share my favorite case that I've come across by one of my favorite people. Now, this particular one is a landmark case that really springboarded our knowledge of what happens to the human body after it dies, and as the man who worked the case would put it, it was a humdinger. Now, in the 70s, Dr. Bill Bass was only a few years into his professorship at the University of Tennessee at Knoxville. He wasn't a medical examiner, but a forensic anthropologist who, in addition to teaching, also helped the police in the field whenever they found a body in an advanced state of decay. So one day he got a call from the local agency. An old Civil War grave had been disturbed on what used to be a plantation belonging to a Confederate officer. Remains had been found and they looked fresh. Our hero arrived at the site to discover the body of a man wearing a tuxedo half in the coffin that belonged to one Colonel William Shy of the Confederates. The flesh was still pink and there was no skeletal remains left in the wet and boggy Tennessee soil, so when the cops asked Dr. Bass how long he thought the man had been dead, he said the famous, fatal last words, "A few months, I guess." So the body was taken back to the medical examiner's office and a workup was done, but strange things started happening. The suit the man was wearing was hand-stitched, and the stitch pattern was reminiscent of the mid-19th century. The clothing itself was pure cotton, no additives, no plastics, no blending, no nothing. Further examination of the coffin revealed not a trace of bone, not anywhere. A sinking suspicion started to settle in amongst the investigators. Eventually, it was revealed that the body was indeed Lieutenant Colonel William Shy, who had fallen in battle in 1864. The reason for his remarkable preservation was that to get his body home from the field, it had been embalmed and hermetically sealed in his coffin. In an anaerobic environment, no bacteria could grow and break down the tissue, and that is how he stayed for a whole 113 years. Eventually, it was determined that grave robbers had disturbed the body looking for goods, but had probably been spooked and fled the scene. This case lit a fire under Bill Bass, and in 1980, he acquired an acre of land behind the UT hospital. And in 1981, the very first truly scientific experiment on human decomposition was conducted. In the 40 years since then, we have learned an enormous amount about how and why things break down, what causes it to speed up or slow down, and even how it looks on a molecular level. If you want to be amazed, you should look up some of Arpad Vass's work on volatile compounds involved in decomp. More than this, though, the first scientists to work on the body farm paved the way for innovations in cut marks, entomology, chemistry, reconstruction, and alums of the program are some of the most well-respected and renowned scientists in the field. I know that as a starry-eyed teenager reading their technical manuals for the first time, these people were my idols and I wanted nothing else but to just be like them. I'm so glad that right now I'm training to be part of the next generation of dedicated scientists and, in my case, physicians, who can speak the language of the dead and don't mind getting their hands dirty. I have the best job in the world, without a doubt. Story 2. Former homicide detective here. Suspicious death, 30-ish male found alone by cleaning staff in the back row of a sparsely attended sci-fi movie. Strange scratching wounds around and in the mouth. Some patache in eyes and on the cheeks, but no signs of strangulation. No obvious signs of chronic illness or disease. Presented as a healthy, normal adult male. Found on his person was a wallet with normal contents and a single canceled movie ticket, indicating he went alone. Weird spy movie crap going on here. In the autopsy, a large amount of popcorn compacted in his esophagus, like half a cup. Dude was apparently excited by the movie, stuffing popcorn in his mouth and, well, choked. The scratch marks around and in his mouth were self-inflicted, trying to dig out popcorn, verified via fingernail scrapings, and his was only DNA present. Loud movie, he was in the back, no one saw or heard him choke. I've never eaten popcorn again. Fresh popcorn during movies will never be the same. Damn. Story 3. Med student, almost graduated here. A couple of years ago, I attended the pathological anatomy course, and during a class, the professor showed us some autopsies. Despite the tremendous smell of 4 to 5 consecutive autopsies, one of them was carried out on a homeless patient that passed away in the ER, probably due to heart failure. The body had massive ascites, fluid in the abdomen, so at first he had to evacuate it. Imagine him doing the procedure, one of my colleagues fainted. Then the next step was to examine the abdominal organs. Now imagine the face of every person in the room when it became clear that the patient had some form of inherited polycystic disease, and the liver and the kidneys were full of cysts. The liver weighed more than 10 kilograms. The normal weight of one is like 2 to 3 kilograms. And the kidneys almost 3 kilograms each, normally just 150 grams each. The professor was really shocked at the beginning, but then he started to really enjoy cutting through the cysts in order to get samples. Second colleague faints, and the other ones were pretty standard, but I think I'll remember forever this one, in particular that liver on the scale. I even took a picture, but I can't find it anymore. Story 4. Working in the ER, a young man comes in, one of 4 in a nasty auto accident. Speed plus inexperience equals car flipped, passengers ejected. One expired shortly after coming into the ER. I transported the body down to the morgue, felt like trying to lift sheets full of rolling bowling balls. Once in the morgue, I commented how unscathed he looked. He really did. Some dirt, the ET tube, and not much else. ME offered that I could view the autopsy if interested, and I was interested. The first thing they noted were the x-rays of the fractures, basically all the major bones, including multiple rib fractures. When they opened the body, the organs were described as near liquefied. It wasn't until weeks later I got the whole story from the EMT who had been on the scene. Seems the passenger had been half in and half out of the window while the car had been flipping. He was just days shy of 17, too. The driver was just days past 16. His parents had bought him a brand new car. He'd had it less than 72 hours. The driver lived, though with severe brain damage. Front and rear passengers died, and the rear driver's side passenger survived with not too much permanent physical damage. I have friends whose kids are getting their driver's license. I never pass up a chance to drop that story on them. I've seen a lot of effed up things in my healthcare career, and that is one of the grand total of 3 that just make me tear up, and it's one from early on. Story 5. Masters in Forensic Pathology here, and you'd be surprised to know the number of people that have life-threatening issues that just never went diagnosed and that they didn't die from. I saw an older guy who died of pneumonia in hospital. On autopsy, the guy had both an enlarged heart and a couple of medium-sized aneurysms in the brain. Another guy in his 70s apparently came into the ER and had chest pain, then died shortly. Died of a heart attack, but he also had cancer. In less natural circumstances, though, saw a guy who had been shot a couple of times, but police only found 1 bullet. Couldn't find the other bullets at all, assumed the police missed it. Went on as normal with the autopsy until we got to the chest cavity. The other bullet was just chilling beside his lung. Turns out it entered the skull, hit the inside, ricocheted down his neck, and into the chest. That was pretty wild. Story 6. I may be late to the party, but I finally have a good story to tell. In medical school, my group's cadaver was an 80-plus-year-old female who was extremely unfit, morbidly obese, with muscles half the size of any other cadavers. Her pectoral muscles were paper-thin, to get some reference. We figured she was bedridden during her last few months, which would somewhat explain these findings. When we started our neurology unit and began to dissect the infratemporal fossa, I discovered a small metal pellet under the skin behind her right ear. My tankmates and I went on to find dozens of these metal pellets strewn around her head's anatomy, with some lodged into the cranium and others in the bones of her face. We contacted her living relatives to get some clarification, and they ended up revealing that when this lady and her brother were children, they said she was about 8 years old back then, they were playing with an old decorative rifle that the family had mounted above the fireplace. And long story short, the brother had accidentally discharged the rifle into her. The aftermath was this lady was blind and wheelchair-bound for the rest of her life, and the pellets weren't at all removed. It was an interesting dissection with that information from then on, but also a sobering moment in reminding our class that our cadavers are humans with their own struggles and rich lives. If you're considering donating your body to science, please know that we don't take the responsibility lightly at all, and a million thank yous aren't enough. I have more stories if anyone is curious. I should add that her granddaughter made a point of saying that this lady did not hold a grudge on her brother and they lived full lives on happy terms. Story 7. We had one cadaver that passed away from natural causes in his late 60s. Given what we found, I'm inclined to believe he never saw a doctor in his whole life. When we begin our dissections, we start with the muscles of the back, the arms, and the legs. Then we move on to the nervous system and eventually the abdominal, thoracic, and pelvic cavities in that order. Everything was pretty textbook up until we exposed her abdomen initially. The anatomy was present, but something just seemed off. After cleaning up some of the fascia and visceral fat, we had exposed the liver, GI tract, stomach, and spleen. Yet something just seemed off, but we couldn't place our fingers on it. It's amazing how something so apparent that's right in front of your eyes didn't click until someone said, hey guys, why is his liver on his left? This man's entire anatomy was mirrored. We found his heart and spleen to be on the right as opposed to the left, and everything on the opposite side of where it was supposed to be. This cadaver had situs inversus totalis, a condition where the internal organs develop on the opposite side of where they're supposed to. It's incredibly rare, with estimated frequency of cases where just the thoracic cavity, the heart and the lungs, is mirrored are around 0.001%. And this gentleman had all of his internal organs mirrored. It almost certainly contributed to his death, unfortunately. The reason I mentioned him probably not having seen a doctor is because if you try to listen to the heart of someone with this condition, you won't hear it because it's just not in the regular spot. The body was eventually taken from us students in order to be dissected professionally and presented to more future students down the line. When parents tell their children they're one in a million, it's not usually true, but it very much may have been true in this gentleman's case. Because of this, I'm off to the doctor to make sure because you can never be too sure. But you know what? I'm sure of 87% of you aren't subscribed to the channel, and that does kind of break my heart a little. So how about we change that by hitting the like button and subscribing to the channel? And for reals, it does help us out. You done? All right, let's get back to the stories then. Story 8. My mom died last September, and the doctors were really perplexed as to what had happened. They had found cancer cells, but things progressed too quickly and she was gone in literally a matter of weeks before we could even determine the type of cancer. Since the doctors didn't have a concrete answer, we sent her remains to a learning hospital in the next county. I knew they were going to cut her open, and I knew they were going to do terrible things, but I also knew they would take it seriously, and I never doubted they would be as respectful as they could. In the report, one of the things they said was, female, no family history of cancer, age 68, appears younger. I don't know why that stuck with me. It makes me cry when I think about it. It made me feel like they took the time to regard her as a human being, even though I know they just noted it for scientific purposes. My mom would have been thrilled to know a team of medical doctors thought she looked young for her age. In the end, they gave us the answers we couldn't get while she was alive. Anaplastic thyroid cancer. Pretty rare, it's really aggressive. As a side note, the autopsy saved my aunt's life, my mom's youngest sister. She requested to get her thyroid retested after we got the results, and literally 4 weeks later, they removed her thyroid completely after finding cancer. Story 9. My master's program had a cadaver lab. Our class was very small, so we were split up into groups of 5 to about 6 cadavers. For gross anatomy examinations, they use all the cadavers in the lab for testing, so you needed to know where everything was on each cadaver in the lab. It's amazing how much we vary on the inside. So we go around and look at everyone's cadaver to study after each class. The head of the gross anatomy lab has a bone saw to cut open the ribs to get into the chest cavity so we can begin the dissection to see the respiratory, cardiac, and gastrointestinal systems. During the respiratory part, one group's cadaver has different lungs, large, shaped weird, bumpy, and very dark purple and blue. Our instructor assumed it was cancer and they couldn't use the lungs for examination because it was too obvious to that group. So they continue into the rest of the abdomen, and this is a very enlarged, bumpy, gray and blue organ. So enlarged and misshapen, the group couldn't really figure out what it would be as it took up a huge amount of space, starting at the last rib to the top of the hip bones. It was so big that the intestines were tiny, shriveled up strings behind it. Our teaching assistant concluded it was the liver and it was also cancerous. The reason the intestines were so small was because the person probably had not been able to eat in her last weeks due to the size of this cancer growing in her liver. I have another one along these lines though too. My grandfather's autopsy was very interesting. He fell down one day and 3 days later we found out he had a brain hemorrhage and needed surgery. He survived the surgery but never recovered and passed in hospice 3 months later. He had a muscular disease similar to ALS, which we knew about, severe asthma, known, only half of a working diaphragm, dementia, and Alzheimer's. I feel like there's another small thing I'm forgetting. This was about 6 or 7 years ago, but either way, I'm still impressed to this day. He always figured out he was going to die of a heart attack. All of the men in his family died around the age of 50, but I remember the pathologist noting that his heart was like the one organ virtually undamaged. Story 10. Not mine, but a doctor I used to work with. Back when he was in school, he would do his cadaver labs really late at night. To many people during the day. One time it was really late, around 2 a.m. He was listening to his lecture on his headphones and he saw the cadaver's arm move and twitch. He thought it was just his mind playing tricks on him, then he saw it do it again, proceeded to run away in a panic. He told a few of his classmates what happened, but nobody believed him. The next day, they had a group cadaver lab with the same cadaver. The arm twitched yet again. The professor did some digging, and it turns out the patient's pacemaker was still fully functional and occasionally fired, causing the arm to twitch. He was so relieved, he thought there was a zombie in there. This doctor is on a whole other level doing cadaver labs up until 2 a.m. Now that's something. Even if it was broad daylight, I would no way in hell do that one. Nope. Story 11. Not exactly an autopsy per se, but it was a patient found unresponsive with CPR in progress by EMS. The man was clearly homeless based on his appearance and smell. He reportedly had not been seen for several days by his friends and was eventually found behind a fast food restaurant dumpster. We were briefly able to get a pulse back, and when the nurse cut his pants off to place a catheter, we saw the cause. He had fashioned some sort of makeshift ring out of the neck of a plastic bottle. It was way too tight and completely cut off the circulation. I did a bedside ultrasound and found his abdomen full of free fluid, which is bad. Most likely his bladder had ruptured from being unable to urinate for days. His lab suggested he was in septic shock and full-blown renal failure as well. He didn't survive much longer than that. I remember another one. In my final year of training, we had a cadaver lab to practice advanced airway management techniques, for example, difficult intubation, cricothyroidotomy, etc. While I was helping an intern do a basic intubation, she commented the tube wouldn't pass. I think she has some kind of growth or mass in her airway. I took a look, asked for some forceps, and pulled out a half-eaten hot dog out of her larynx. It, of course, had been embalmed along with the rest of her. Cause of death identified. Story 12. Not an autopsy doctor, but I did take anatomy and physiology 2 with lab in college. The lab was working on cadavers being prosected by more advanced students. A prosection is the dissection of a cadaver, human or animal, or part of a cadaver, by an experienced anatomist in order to demonstrate for students anatomic structure. Anyway, one of the cadavers, we had a male and female for obvious reasons, was a big old linebacker-looking dude, like an older bodybuilder type. IIRC, his age at the time of death was around late 50s. His heart had been removed by the anatomist, and we were examining it because it was very enlarged and contributed to his death. We all had to hold it in our hands to feel the heft, like size and weight, and compare it to the heft of the female's heart, which was normal-sized, about like a large apple. The male's heart, for comparison, was the size of a small cantaloupe. I went first, for whatever reason, and the instructor lifted the enlarged heart out of its preservative bath and placed it in my hands. I damn near dropped the thing when it shocked me with what it felt like a jolt of electricity. I, understandably I think, made a startled noise and the instructor took the heart back before I could jiggle it onto the floor. "Oh," she said, "I forgot to warn you, look out for the pacemaker." Apparently, when someone has a pacemaker, there's a battery too, and they don't bother taking it out or off. They just snip the leads and leave it there, so if you touch both bare leads, you get a mild shock even through your exam gloves. Now that was a mildly disturbing experience. Story 13. While in medical school, we had to observe an autopsy and could assist. One of the lectures was to observe for head trauma. Now you do this by hitting the skull with a hard object, scissor, or the like. A hollow sound is normal, but a dull sound indicates trauma. One of the other students did this exam and found a dull sound. The coroner had not yet himself examined the person and was very surprised as he had not been informed by the police of head trauma. They then continued to examine the head and they found a wound through the skull. And all of a sudden, the person was a quote-unquote crime scene and they had to call the police again and leave the person as untouched as possible. I believe it was later confirmed that the person had ended himself, but it could have been a murder. As someone pointed out, there must have been some information that was missed between the police and the coroner. I myself wasn't present, but I do believe the story is true, as it is now a lecture on why you should always examine for skull trauma and not just assume something before knowing. Story 14. I'm a veterinarian and sometimes I do necropsy, basically autopsy for animals, and one of the more notable cases involved a prized Wagyu cow that died mysteriously. Wagyu cows are very expensive to rear and fetch a good price at the slaughterhouse. After cutting her open, I found metal wires extending from her stomach into her heart. It's what we call hardware disease. Apparently, the cow decided that eating metal wires for constructing fences was a good idea. Normally, the farm hands are quite good at keeping these hazards away from the inquisitive bovines, but I guess slip-ups do happen from time to time. Alright, I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and if you made it this far, I'm sure 100% you're also going to enjoy Doctors, What Made You Say, How Are You Still Alive? Story 5 will leave you speechless. See you in that video, and thank you for watching this one.